Okay, y'all, we're getting ready to get ready for part 2 or part 3. Can't add. I'm a lawyer. Can't add. Okay, I want to welcome our next panel, and I hope everybody really enjoyed their lunch today, and we are, again, so grateful to have everybody here with us. So may I call up to the stage Cece Cox, who is the CEO of Resource Center, where the actual exhibit will be through October the 7th. And then I'm also going to call up State Representative Jessica González and Miriam Laeky, who is the head of government affairs for Equality Texas. And I'm going to turn it over to y'all.
Good afternoon. Hope you had a good lunch. If you haven't had lunch yet, then I hope you're happy and you have caffeine and all the things you need. Although you will not need caffeine for this panel because amazing, brilliant minds here to my side, that is. So I think you'll be entertained. But it's my pleasure to be with you. As Shelly said, I'm the CEO of Resource Center, Cece Cox, she, her pronouns. And Resource Center is a local LGBTQIA plus center that offers programs and services for the queer community. And that ranges from health services, direct programming and services for health, strengthening families and communities, and providing transformative education and advocacy. And what we're going to speak about today, to frame it up a little bit, is the legislation that is happening, some past legislation that has happened in Texas, taken place in Texas, and what we anticipate looking forward to the next session, the context within which that fits across the country and the trends that we're seeing for legislation impacting the queer community, and also then how legislation impacts the lived experience of folks in our communities across this large state of Texas. So I would like to do a brief intro. Shelly did point out, but just want to make sure you know we're with Representative Jessica González, who is represents District 104 in our state, and she was first elected in 2019 and serves as the vice chair of the Texas House LGBTQ Caucus, and has been a vocal advocate on behalf of our community and our issues, as well as comprehensive non-discrimination protections, criminal justice reform, voting rights expansion, and affordable housing. And Miriam Laeky, is also she, her pronouns, is the Government Affairs Director at Equality Texas, which is our statewide organization for LGBTQIA plus equality. And prior to being with Equality Texas, Miriam was the Executive Director of the Texas Legislative Black Caucus and has worked in organizing and operations roles for the Texas House Democratic Caucus and Harris County Commissioner Rodney Ellis. So thank you all, and please welcome me in thanking them for being here today. We will take questions at the end of the conversation up here. So I'm going to check my watch every now and then just to make sure that we're getting to the mark where you're able to have your voices heard and ask what comes up during the conversation. So with that, we will get into it. Within the last few years, and even longer period than that, you haven't been able to pick up a newspaper or watch the television or see something on our streaming where it hasn't been some conversation and topic about anti-LGBTQ legislation. Transgender rights have been very high up in the news headlines, and unfortunately, action against trans folks. Many number of other freedoms are under assault as well. So I'd like to start off by talking, and Miriam, I'm going to come to you first. If you could give us, from your perspective, an overview of what you're seeing in the national trends. We know there's over 500 bills that have been introduced in 2024 alone across legislatures in the United States, different state legislatures. But what do you see tracking across the country legislatively?
Yeah. So good afternoon, everyone. This will be heavy conversation. But the overview, as of right now, as Cece had mentioned, over 500 bills being tracked nationally that are designated as anti-LGBTQIA+. This has increased tenfold over the last 5 years. I think there was a number that stated that over half of all of the increased hundreds of bills that we've encountered have happened within the last 2 years. And so this is an incredible resurgence that we've seen as of recent. Of those 500 bills, more specifically designated, over 200 of those specifically target transgender and non-binary folks. And so the scope and the breadth of these discriminatory pieces of legislation is catastrophic for all folks within the spectrum of LGBTQ community. As far as a very specific overview of some of the trends that we're seeing, obviously laws banning transgender or gender-affirming care to transgender folks is consistent nationally. Laws that are censoring school curriculum, so seeing that within what teachers are able to practice within their classrooms, designations on what school boards and other municipal boards are able to designate within curriculum is being attacked. We've seen on the farthest end of the spectrum complete erasure bills, and that's happened as of recent in Montana and Tennessee. So these would specifically take away legal protections and rights and prohibit claims of sexual orientation or gender identity discrimination in employment, housing, healthcare. I mean, that's a complete rollback on rights for queer folks in those states, right? Very familiar to what we saw last session, bans on collegiate participation for trans athletes in sports. That happened not just here in Texas, but Ohio is an example of that. Different expansions of the Don't Say Gay bill. We see different iterations of that happening across southern states. I think Florida has a very important example in HB 1067, which prohibits instruction on sexual orientation and gender identity from pre-K to 8th grade, which is an iteration that we're seeing across states. Once again, kind of resurge. Laws threatening medical malpractice and aiding and abetting as sort of a part 2 to the transgender banning on healthcare, and putting criminal penalties on insurers and medical providers, and so dissuading them from being able to take care of their patients, right? In Florida, SB 254 is an example of this, where criminal penalties on providers are now being given, and the threat of licenses being taken away. Medicare is now prohibited in public funds for coverage and benefits of this. And so just an ever consistent rollback of rights is what we're seeing nationwide, which is not fun to discuss and is not hopeful, but
a longer list than we'd like to have,
yeah.
right? For sure. Well, Representative González, I'd like to turn to you. And in 2017, the Texas legislature was dealing with what we call the bathroom bills, who can and cannot use bathrooms. Of course, that was an attack against transgender individuals. But could you give us an overview of what you've seen in the Texas Ledge since the 2017 session in regards to our community?
I mean, a lot of even the legislation that Miriam mentioned just now, I mean, we've seen those bills, filed in the Texas House, and we can expect to see, similar bills, being introduced this next session as well. Our community is always on the menu, every single session, and with the change in the legislature right now, with the new Republicans coming in that are further on the right than their predecessors, it's going to be even worse. I mean, we're definitely going to put up a fight. But that's why we have to be proactive on legislation. That's why things like non-discrimination ordinances are so important. But I mean, this last session, we we're successful in defeating the majority. I think about 96% of the legislation. I think it's 140 bills.
140 plus.
Yeah. And so we were able to defeat the majority of them. Unfortunately, there was a couple. There were a couple that passed. For example, SB 14, which affects trans children from receiving, getting their hormones and hormone blockers rather, and so that was really devastating to see pass. It was heartbreaking. There was lots of tears in the room, in the chamber. These families show up, day after day after day with their kids. And testify, but nothing seems to move some of these legislators. So that one passed. Several have actually that did pass were ultimately blocked because they were discriminatory. So that's great, especially given our court system right now. Usually it doesn't work. They usually don't rule in our favor, and so this was great that some of these laws got blocked. But there's a whole list of legislation that was filed last session. But like I said, we just have to continue to try to defeat them and hope that the courts will make the right decision if they do pass.
Well, thank you for that overview, and it's a segue into, I'd like to turn to you, Miriam, and ask, not that anybody has a crystal ball that actually works or that we're going to hold you responsible, but what do you see as you prepare for the legislative session that will open in January 2025?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for context, there is no real uniqueness to their bigotry, if I can speak plainly. So we're really looking at states like Florida, Tennessee, Ohio, Kansas in some respects. So those other supermajority states that operate on an annual schedule for their legislature. So the benefit of having our legislature biannually is we get a little bit of a forecast during the off years. And so we've taken a lot of great notes of what's come out, not just in 2023, but 2024. And what we saw within our research of 2024 is that over half of those anti-LGBTQIA bills that were filed this year are actually refilings. So it's likely that we're not going to see too much of what we haven't already battled before, which is scary in a lot of respect. But they're coming for it again and again and again. And this is where the strategy comes in because the numbers in the building don't operate on our side, right? Whereas public opinion does, and I love to see all of our storming ins of the Capitol. The fight, as it relates to Representative González and all of the colleagues on the floor and in those offices, the fight is really within the chamber and in those committees. So while we're taking those notes and doing that forecasting, I think some context that the representative highlighted is that the dynamics within the building have shifted considerably. I think the old school good faith politicking is very rare, to put it generously. And so to even diagnose where the line or the floor is on a lot of issues is really hard. I don't think any of us would really have counted on the sort of conversations we had last session to happen. I mean, there are members who are part of the championing of these rights back in the heyday and have now found themselves in a deja vu situation of having to come back to those same fights. But if I was to put a couple of ideas out there for preparation, I definitely would say that an extension of healthcare bans to adults is most likely. Last session, I think it was Representative Tinderholt, if I'm not mistaken, had already filed a bill that would have put the age of 26 out there for a trans healthcare ban. That didn't go anywhere. We know that SB 14 did. But in other states, obviously, that has made movement and passage. So it's likely that that goalpost is one to be moved going into this next session. And then kind of a sub point of that is, are those penalties on healthcare providers and insurers, right? So either formalizing in statute those criminal penalties, or just ways in order to dissuade folks from providing those healthcare services, right? I think public education consistently is going to be on the docket in one form or another. I think curriculum is something that we're going to have to take a look at, both on the K through 12 side, and we've already had the fight on the higher education side, but I think doubling down on things as it relates to DEI, and topics and conversations on gender identity and sexual orientation. So limiting like those teachings. I know that like things like the Parental Bill of Rights was a huge topic of conversation last session. And so things under the guise of student protections is likely. I know that the governor has alluded to things like the banning of trans teachers. I don't know how you formalize that into real words, but just outlandish things like that, right? And I think, and we'll probably dive into it, but things on local control and the controlling of those ordinances for sure.
Something that's come up for me in the course of this conversation, and I also want to tie some things to the earlier amazing history lessons that we were given and call to action from this morning on some of the panels, is Representative González referenced that a lot of people and the impact of the stories and the emotion of the stories of families that showed up to speak on behalf of their transgender children. And also by way of background, I feel like maybe a little background would be good in that the law that got passed in Texas requires that, prohibits healthcare, proper, medically necessary healthcare to be given to transgender individuals under the age of 18. So as Miriam is referencing the fact that we anticipate a bill that would make the same type of care illegal for someone over the age of 18. So that's the current state we're in, and the distinction that could happen in the next session. But the ability that we have, because this is a long list of threats that we're facing, and the reality that we're in is long. It is heavy. It can feel very heavy. It can be immobilizing at times. There were the day that Shelly and I were there together to testify, testifying separately, but we went together. It was horrible. I hadn't heard the types of things that had been said against members of the LGBTQ community since the mid-90s. And there were so many people. The hearings seemed to be stacked with the side against us, and then finally maybe somebody speaking on our behalf was able to have their time at the podium. But in the afternoon at the rotunda, if you haven't ever been to the Texas Capitol, it really is architecturally a stunning building, particularly inside. And there are multiple rotundas, but there's one down toward where the room was that was having the hearing on the bill. And there was a break, and so everybody went outside. But while folks had been in watching or testifying in this room of fluorescent lights, which will suck the soul out of you already, when there was a break, we went outside into the sunlight in this rotunda space, and it had hundreds of people in it, and it's layered. So there were 3 levels, I think, and people were all around and on the ground level, and a lot of young people and a lot of transgender individuals and gender nonconforming folks, and a lot of people with signs. And for me, as it's been pointed out, many of us have been doing this for a while, so the calendar is feeling like a real thing too lately. But to have a moment where I realized or saw in a tangible way that there are generations coming behind us, and they're here. They're here right now, and they're showing up, and they're being part of the legislative process. And while we are in a movement, and by definition, a movement isn't always linear and forward and in a straight line. A movement is 2 steps forwards and 3 back. And all of the in-betweens. So we didn't win. We didn't win. That bill was passed, and it's harming individuals and families in Texas. Families who have decided they can no longer stay here and properly take care of their transgender children. But we are mobilizing people, and people care, and there are a lot of allies involved in what we're trying to accomplish in full and lived equality for LGBTQIA plus people. So I took heart in that, and it doesn't mean that the battles won't remain hard, but I do hope that through community centers, through political organizing, through the work that Equality Texas does, people will continue to voice and show up and encourage one another and educate. Because the other thread that's coming from the conversations this morning are that whatever will be happening in the courts to help us gain rights will be happening in the courts. And thank goodness for Lambda for leading that charge. And other national organizations doing work, and local and regional organizations. But laws are what we need. And the companion that happens when laws are passed and progressed is that we change hearts and minds. And that has always been the strategy of Lambda Legal, to work simultaneously with addressing hearts and minds. And that means being out, telling our stories, educating our friends and family about what we know. If we have transgender friends, speak on their behalf, and do those things that we know by showing up can help open the eyes of people that we know and love, and that are willing to learn, while the legislators are doing what they can do in the ledge, and while the litigators are doing what they can do in the courts. So with all that, Representative González, before I move to you, Miriam, if you could tell us, what do you think do you think there are lessons learned from the 2023 session for people who want to get engaged that we can take to the 2025 session?
Yeah, I think I was working in the building, and so in a slightly different capacity. But I think for all intersectional communities, what 2023 really taught us was that, and I say this a lot to anyone trying to have a little bit more awareness of the operations of the building, is that coming into January to discuss strategy, you're already 10 steps behind. So important notes are that pre-filing opens November 11th. So that's the Monday after the general election. And they make their, members are able to pre-file their best pieces of legislation, and that's a little bit more of that forecast. And so I would say when I was working with the Black Caucus, we knew about the DEI ban was coming because that was pre-filed up in December, right? And so I think lessons learned from last session is, one, they're not coy about their intentions. They don't have to be. So taking notes now is really part of our internal conversations and amongst allies and amongst coalition partners, because once again, they're not unique, and they know exactly what they're gunning for going into next session. I think outside of that, as far as lessons learned, I think, and this might be a little bit of like the optimism in me too, is that there was still room for bipartisanship and productive conversations still within all of the craziness of last session. And so I know Representative Venton Jones had a lot of great success, even still with movement on certain pieces of legislation. And so that was HB 3377 and HB 2235, which would have made HIV testing mandatory as far as within regular checkups and STD testing. And so while that didn't pass, was able to have movement on the floor, if I'm not mistaken, or within committee. And then HB 2055, with the repealing of the sodomy law, having bipartisan support, but being timed out by the schedule of the legislature. So I think that would be the biggest two lessons learned coming into last session. I don't know if the representative on the inside of the building has any insights other than that.
We just have to it's kind of hard to tell because we don't know what next session is gonna be like exactly. But we do know they're relentless in their attacks on our community, and so we just have to make sure that our people, because we show up, right? Our community shows up. We got to show up to vote as well this November to make sure that we are electing more folks that are pro-equality, and so we can hopefully see less attacks in our community. But it's important for folks to show up and give testimony, and I know it can be very exhausting, and I know that folks don't necessarily can take the day off from work to go to Austin, but if you can, I encourage you to do that. But I think we work very well with groups like Equality Texas, Lambda Legal, and so just kind of having everybody together working to defeat these pieces of legislation. I think that's just what we just keep doing, right? But even and I wanted to kind of add a little bit to the previous question, but just because we're not in session doesn't mean that our community still isn't under attack. I mean, we've seen for example. At Fair Park recently, there was a RuPaul Live show, and the legislator who I think he's the one who filed it, Matt Shaheen, that he was on drag performances, and so he made a big stink about it, wrote a letter. This was like recent, and is threatening to defund a state park or Fair Park rather, which is where it was held, right? And that was just like last week or a couple of weeks ago. We're also seeing the policy on gender markers, right? The form that you fill out to change your gender marker just changed, right? And whether they can do that legally, probably not, but as we know, they don't necessarily follow the law themselves. And so we have seen that. This was just a couple weeks ago as well. So we continue. Oh, and then I know that school boards are also changing their policies within the schools about using preferred or gender or pronouns, right? I forget what school district it was recently.
Yeah,
Keller.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we are seeing, we still are seeing attacks in our community, whether it's at a local level, and that's why it's also important that these folks that are getting voted onto these school boards, right? So there's that. So I just wanted to add on to that.
Well, since I gave the unfair question of looking into a crystal ball, I just as a matter of equity, I'm going to ask you the same thing. And what are your legislative priorities for 2025, and any crystal balling you'd be willing to do for what you see ahead, even beyond this upcoming session?
Well, one of my priorities has been my comprehensive non-discrimination bill. We were all working on it, I think after my first session, so back in 2020, I believe, and we worked on it for over a year. We worked with lawyers that have been successful in passing, legislation like this. A lot of folks don't know that Texas doesn't have these protections, that you can get denied housing, that you can get fired, you can get denied public accommodations. It's a patchwork right now. I think 28 states have a comprehensive bill, and so I would like to at least get a hearing on it. And so we've kept filing it, and I think it's time that we're more vocal on our issues, because we're giving them the mic, that we're giving them and they get their little videos so they can put up on Twitter, but it's time that we talk about our issues and why it's important to pass legislation like this. It can get a little scary when you take legislation like this to the floor, because as we know, right, they're relentless in their attack on our communities, and they can add amendments to it. They can take a good bill and make it awful, right? And so that is always a possibility, but I think, trying to get a hearing in committee and just be more proactive on equality or pro-equality legislation, I think is important. I think our people need to see that. Our community needs to see that our issues are important too, and that we can't just always be on the defense.
Very good point. I'd like to turn a little bit. You people maybe have trouble hearing me? Okay, sorry if anything's been dropped. I'd like to talk a little bit about what we could do to engage the audience here, but as we know, the many, many people who are out there who do show up and who are interested in supporting issues and pro-equality in the state. I know today there was someone from Patrick Hanley was here from Resource Center to do voter registration, and we're engaged in that. And lots of other organizations are. Ray's here from LULAC. I know LULAC does a lot of voter registration. So that's important as a basic. But there's always questions during session, and as you pointed out, Miriam, if you're just now paying attention and it's session time, it might be too late. So there's so much work that can be done in advance as well as during session. There's lots of education that can be done. So, Miriam, what sort of action would you ask that folks do to help empower Equality Texas, help empower themselves, and in preparation for session and making our stories known to our elected officials?
Absolutely. And so if anyone is slightly unaware of the scope of Equality Texas, so we're the largest nonpartisan political advocacy organization fighting for the rights of LGBTQ folks here in Texas. So our operations extend past government affairs and the lobbying side of things. We work within the field statewide to ensure, like the representative highlighted, that these smaller egregious acts don't go unnoticed within localities. So we're tracking and mobilizing and sending action alerts for everything up from or down from, the school board level, up to our work on the state level. We do a lot of communications and education for folks, and whether that's within, in-person dialogues or on our social media campaigns. We're really trying to be as holistic as possible with our outreach and our mobilization of folks in this state, and being able to be a consistent voice. As far as a charge to leave everyone with, if you could visit our website, equalitytexas.org, and sign up for our newsletter and for our action alerts. We are very consistent and I can't say overly communicative. I think we're just, we keep you aware. So if you sign up for that, you'll be on a first to know list of all the actions that are going out and that we're trying to get folks involved with and aware of. I would point folks to that and to consistently engage with us on our social platforms. Some of the most of, I would actually argue, of the alerts that we get come from community. Just last week, got a call from an activist over in Corpus because their library board had moved up a recommendation to city council to create a newly designated library card for those under 18 that would completely ban their ability to check out books that were deemed sexually explicit. And so a lot of that stuff, again, would go under the radar. I'm not in Corpus. And so we really rely on community to be the pulse on the ground and to let us know what's going on. A lot of bill ideas, something that we champion every single session is a good 100 good bill list. I think last session was actually, it matched at 140, so it's a little tit for tat to balance defense and offense. But a lot of those bill ideas come from the lived experiences of those in our communities. So it's a very open door policy to communicate back to us of what's impacting you and your families, your children, and our charge to consistently be a voice for awareness in the state.
Would you talk a little bit about what it's actually like when it comes ledge time and Equality Texas sends out, hey, we have a hearing coming up, or there's the day of action, you call it something else, but what's that actually like? Because there may be people listening in here that would like to know the nitty-gritty nuts and bolts of if they could actually show up and do something. And also, I think the legislative process can feel mysterious to people if they haven't participated, but it's actually really fun and really great to expose your children to learn. So
Absolutely.
Give us a little bit of that.
Yeah. So we operate on a 140-day calendar that feels like 2 years. Most times we don't operate with the luxury of time necessarily. And so our action alerts really operate for very fast response, to get people out, to come to committees, to blast the, phone calls and emails out their legislators when movement on a bill that we either support or oppose is moving rather quickly, and there's no consistency or frankly grace afforded to when we would need to flood a committee hearing or something. I mean, that could happen within like a 48-hour notice, right? And so within those action alerts, you would receive like an email and or a text that would say, HB whatever is having movement and scheduled for a hearing in public health committee at 9 a.m. We need you to come register and testify on why this is a bad bill, and that's worked very well in the past. We really have rainbowed out the Capitol on a number of occasions. I think last session, Cece, I think you were highlighting within the Rotunda example, March 24th will be our advocacy day at the Capitol. And that's when we galvanize folks from all corners of the state to come lobby and just exist on the grounds of the Capitol, just because we exist. And that's last year we had over 1,000 people statewide show up, and then we had about 36 action alerts that we're able to successfully launch last session in both support and opposition of bills. So yeah, I mean, it's an open invitation for you to come on behalf of us and our All In for Equality Coalition to have your voices heard. We do all the reserving of rooms, and we'll feed you and train you on all the testimony jargon. But it's a very fast response way for us to make sure our voices are heard.
Thank you. And getting on the email list for Equality Texas is the first way to get started, right?
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
Great, fantastic. Yeah. Similarly, Representative González, what is a way that is effective to be engaged with your office?
Well, we could always just call our office or email. I mean, we do check our email, and we're happy to, if you have any questions about testifying or anything like that. I know that Equality Texas is fantastic at setting all that up, but we're always a resource too. So it was how people can engage, right?
Yes.
But Equality Texas, for sure, definitely reach out to them. But look, we just got back from, I know Miriam was there as well, from the DNC, and former First Lady Michelle Obama said this is not the time to sit on your hands and wait, right? And wait for somebody to ask you to help. Like, it's time for you to do something. And so, that has really resonated with me as like one of my favorite quotes from the convention. And it's true, because our lives are on the line here. I mean, and not just LGBTQ issues. I mean, women's health care. I mean, you name it, and it's under attack. And we're going backwards. And so, I've committed to investing in voter registration efforts and GOTV efforts in my district with the limited campaign funds that I have. And it's a safe it's a safe seat, but we still got to do our part. And we got to make sure that folks turn out to vote, to help folks like Colin Allred, who is running against Ted Cruz. There's so many opportunities across the state that we can actually make an impact on some of these races. And that will impact what session will be like. We saw, when my first election, we saw what happened when we flipped 12 seats. I mean, that completely changed the tone and the legislation that came to the floor. We didn't see as many attacks on our community. Something did pass, but it really, they worked with us to really water it down to essentially it didn't do anything. And so we all had to make that commitment as well. If we care about the future of our state. There are several ways to get involved. I know folks can't always give a contribution to a candidate. And if you can't, volunteer to knock on doors, volunteer to make phone calls, volunteer to become a deputy registrar, and help some of these organizations like LULAC and a whole host of organizations. I know Stonewall Democrats of Dallas does a lot of voter registration drives. And so there are plenty of ways, to get involved. But right now is the time, because November is so important. Not only for our the presidential race, but also just like I said, down ballot. And there's a lot of potential here in Texas to change some of these seats, the representation of some of these seats. And so I'm hopeful that we will, and that will eventually impact, for next session on what kind of legislation that we see moving. And then also, we're going to be electing a new speaker, and that's also going to be indicative in regards to they're the ones that determine. The speaker is a person who determines what legislation ultimately comes to the floor, and what we have to debate on the floor. And so that's going to be really important too. But again, the election results are going to matter with that. And so I encourage you to get involved, and if you reach out to your representative, your elected official. We are responsive, so I encourage you to do so.
Thank you. And your staff works all year long, even without being in session. So anybody can pick up the phone, send an email anytime to both your local and your office in Austin, right? And legislators typically are very good at responding. Also, I'd just like to make note that thank you for being a member, an out-elected member, and part of the LGBT caucus. That wasn't even a thing when I started doing advocacy years ago, and so there is progress that has been made in Texas over the years on all levels of advocacy and education, and we just have to keep plugging away at that. Before we turn it over to Q&A, I'd like to ask if you have any stories that you could share, things that you've heard from your constituents because of the impact of bills that were passed in the last session. I wouldn't necessarily, even outside of my district, yes. We, you mentioned, we had several families that have trans kids that moved out of the state, and it was heartbreaking because this is their home. They had to pick up and move, and not everybody can do that. Not everybody can afford to just leave their job, leave their home, find a new job, put their kid in a new school. That this is the impact that legislation has on real lives, right? And so and it leaves you with some PTSD, right? And some that you just will never get over, right? These are families, moms that session after session after session come to the Capitol and advocate for their child. And it's just, that's just really, really heartbreaking. We saw people that were moving because they didn't, the abortion ban, right? I was talking to the president or former president of UTD from the DEI, that legislation that passed. And, he was telling me that how difficult it was to even just hire professors now. And so we're losing, these brilliant people that they don't want to come to Texas. It could be because they don't want to raise their daughter in a state that is not going to give her her own autonomy over her own body, right? And so we're seeing that. We're seeing people that don't want to come here, and that is going to, in my opinion, I think will impact the future of our state, right? It's gonna impact these universities, their abilities to the research that they do, at their universities, a whole host of things. And so that's going to affect folks that are going to school here. It's going to affect the people that want to stay here, that are going to add, right, to Texas. And so these things impact real people. And so, again, I encourage you to be involved in, if you can, to make sure that we're changing, the landscape of the legislature. Thank you. And there's been a giant, over lunch this came up as a topic, a giant chilling effect as a result of the anti-DEI initiative, which has legislated the fact that publicly funded universities cannot do certain DEI activities. And immediately it became interpreted in a much broader way than the bill is actually written. And it has spilled into lots of places, including corporations. Like every week there's I see a new release of some corporation that has pulled back or eliminated its DEI functions. And make no mistake, things are being done to cause confusion and to cause chaos, because if something becomes unclear, then people will not take the chance of violating a law. Doctors are afraid that their insurance companies won't provide them with insurance. Teachers are afraid that they'll do something that puts them over the boundary. So even the threat and the fear of these anti-DEI initiatives at one level are spilling into all kinds of other ones. With that, I'd like to thank you both and open it up to questions from the audience. So if you've got something that has come up for you as you listen to our speakers, would you please raise that up?
Give me just a second. We're going to start with Aaron right here. Hang on. Okay, got Aaron Burke. And so, Aaron, if you would.
Thank you. Hi, question for you. So I remember the notorious bathroom bill, right? I think it was in North Carolina, and just after it got passed, a bunch of corporations, right, were up in arms. And if I think about the trend that a lot of corporations are moving, especially from California to Texas because of favorable tax laws, et cetera, is there a way that we can, and I know this is like the legal component, right, like Lambda Legal, but is there a way that we could somehow leverage those corporate partners to, they want their employees to come to Texas, right, if they're moving their corporate headquarters. And a lot of them don't want to move because, especially if they're coming from San Francisco, right, it's a completely different environment. I was just trying to think if there's a way that we could leverage the corporations that have a vested interest in equality, basically, because it's good for business to help move forward some of these measures.
I'll take part of that, but as far as like Equality Texas, and we have our incredible senior advisor, Angela Hale here, we operate Texas Competes, which is a very expansive advisory board of 1,500 private companies. And so, yes to your first part, and that is very easy in the past to get the sign-on from larger corporations because it is good business to do good by people. That's unequivocally, a truth that should be held up. Unfortunately, we operate, again, in a time and leadership where trying to go around it, but, I think looking at things like the gender marker denial process right now of complete intervention into the judicial process and oversight by the OAG's office and the bullying of that office to those agencies is precedent for what folks anticipate could happen, right? If they're out and they're very loud about DEI, support of, more community approved just sentiment, right? So I guess it's tricky and it's a harder conversation to have right now.
Don't you think also that a lot of corporations doing business in Texas have to play it both sides of the aisle because they're advocating for a certain business interest? They need to expand their plant in this place, or they need to be able to build something in this place, and will require all kinds of support from their legislators. So they often will hesitate to step out on what they view as a more social versus a business matter.
I would completely agree with that. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. Lee, you're welcome.
So I'm wondering, this is a question about the organization of religious organizations. I'm wondering the influence that the conservative religious organizations have for what you see, for you, I'm asking this question to the representative. And then I'm wondering on the Equality Texas side, what is the organizational structure that you have in working with religious organizations that are progressive, positive, or at least sort of neutral? And is there anything that we can do to participate in those kinds of strong voices? And if there are other non-religious voices, Representative, I guess I'm asking you, are there others like that we can have counter voice?
It doesn't come to mind a specific religious organization, but I definitely encourage, I would love to work with a religious organization that chooses not to use divisive or discriminatory language, because as we've seen, right, the far right folks, they use religion, I guess you could say as a sword or as a shield, right? And we know when you read the Bible that's not what the interpretation actually is. And so I definitely encourage, if you know of any organizations, please share them with me, because I would love to work with them. I think in regards to organizations, I work a lot with Equality Texas, Lambda Legal, ACLU. They all work in a coalition, Equality Coalition, and so we're all on the same page when it comes down to it at the Capitol.
To the representative's point, that's the benefit of the coalition work. So Texas Freedom Network has a specific pastor, I guess, board, network. That's a great word. Pastoral network that operates within our issues and advocates at the Capitol. So they're really great at turnout. I know as of recent, like Americans United for the Separation of Church and State is a really good organization that's actually this month working on some of the actions on the SBOE side, on the curriculum considerations for incorporating biblical teachings in our public schools. So organizations like that do exist within the state, and Texas Freedom Network is a great coalition partner of ours that leads that way.
Okay. Julie has a question.
Thank you. Are there particular legislators who, in your opinion, tend to be like the repeat offenders in terms of introducing these terrible bills? And if so, what are their names? Where are they from? No, I don't want to sound, that's very, what is their home address? I'm totally kidding. But do you see repeat players in that space?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Tony Tinderholt is one, and he's actually from the North Texas area. And he is relentless with it. I mean, and it's not even just, a filing of individual bills, right? It's also amendments. I mean, that's another part. I mean, even just in the budget, which is we have to pass the budget before we can do anything else. It's not even relevant to the budget. I mean, whatever they can do to try to slip it through, and so we have to always be vigilant, right? Because they'll file it on the floor, right? So he's one. Who else? Schatzline.
Yeah. Colkhorst and...
You have Equality Texas has a report card, don't you?
We do.
Yeah.
Thank you, Cece. If you check out our scorecard on our website, and so it actually does a comparative analysis between the last 2 or 3 sessions of how folks have either gotten worse or better. And it's both Democrats and Republicans, both chambers. And we were a little spicy this time around.
But, we are going to get some, like I said, when I mentioned earlier, that there's going to be a big change in the makeup because, Republicans that were considered more moderate, they got defeated in their primary. And so this new crop of legislators that are coming in are super, super far right. And so we expect that they're going to be
worse.
Yes.
Yeah. 30 new freshmen, almost 30 new freshmen entering that building. So, I mean, the old heads who were, I don't know what the word moderate means anymore, but decent to an extent, and some of their own champions. I mean, Stephanie Click, who's the chair of public health, who passed SB 14, is no longer there and was primaried. I mean, that's the concern with whatever the floor and the line is even their most egregious folks didn't do enough last session. John Kemple, who passed SB 17, the DEI ban, lost his primary. I mean, so I'm not a Republican, but I don't know what those conversations are like.
Buckle up, Buttercup.
It's never enough.
So recently, the Rainbow LULAC Council did a voter registration drive at Roundup, and we also asked people to confirm that they're still registered. 4 of the people that evening thought that they were registered to vote, but were on suspense. The governor has announced 1.1 or 1.2 million Texans have been taken off the rolls. What is the future of voter registration and the legislation and the impact there? Because if we're going to change this, we have to be able to vote. And I'm sorry, a provisional vote that they give you because you're maybe registered, maybe not, is not going to cut it. What is the thought for next year on voter registration and
well, you know, I mean,
bills
well,
like that?
they passed that big voter suppression bill when I was vice chair of the elections committee, and you would think that that would be enough, right? But no, each session, I mean, we're hearing it even now, right? They're going to continue to try to erode, right, our elections process here in Texas. That's why it's important that we register as many people now, make sure they're registered and they vote, right? Because that's really going to be the only way, unless something passes at a federal level that are going to protect people. But you know, I don't see Texas passing anything that's even just pro, you know, voter, but not in this makeup of the legislature. And so, you know, we got to just get rid of them. We got to vote and get rid of them. That's the only way that we're gonna be able to at least start, you know, changing the laws, you know, because even the voter suppression law they passed, I mean, even elections administrators, you know, can't even, you know, interpret it, right? And so it's a challenge. I mean, I wish that you know, we could move forward and have online registration or same day voter registration. I just don't see Texas doing that anytime soon, unfortunately.
We've got another question, Karen.
Thank you. I know this was touched on a little bit, but I just wanted to delve a little bit deeper. What legislation do you anticipate in the pipeline that may stem from the recent DPS and Bureau of Vital Statistics actions taken in the last 2 weeks? The Bureau of Vital Statistics taken on August 30th against denying the gender marker changes granted under the court orders. What are you anticipating as far as legislative priorities that you might be seeing in bills coming down the pike?
So, and I want to get this correct, but I think it was SB 162 by Perry last session that really was a precursor for all of this and would have done the same thing, and fortunately didn't pass. Unfortunately, that doesn't matter to the AG's office. So I would anticipate a refiling of that bill and a prioritization of that, frankly. This has happened in Florida. Frankly, we're a little bit more expedited than Florida was. They had a 6-month gap between when their state ID and their birth certificate process happened, you know, was impacted. Ours was a matter of days. So I don't think it's too wild to assume that this would be a priority to put that into statute.
Any other questions? Sure, Mark. Come on. Here we go.
Thanks, Shelly. It's a question for Representative González. Since Dade Phelan won his runoff, maybe it's way too early to start predicting speakership possibilities, but do you think he has what is the likelihood of him winning the House Speaker role again? And I got the sense that he was kind of a friend behind the scenes for LGBTQ. Maybe that's too strong a word, but is that accurate? And I mean, just kind of curious about your views of him and his role and what his likelihood of success next session would be.
Well, I mean, in the past, you know, he was helpful. You know, when he used to serve as chair of the State Affairs, and you know, he was quoted saying, you know, I'm done bashing the gay community, LGBTQ community, right? And so we saw that as, you know, the great, right? But and in his first session of being speaker, you know, I think he tried to be helpful. As Miriam mentioned, I mean, as we both have kind of mentioned, just the how aggressive that Republicans are when eating their own. Right? If you don't do this, like, oh, you're a rhino, right? If you don't pass this, you don't pass that. And I think that he kind of, you know, maybe shied away from just being, you know, holding some of that stuff back, and leaving it up to the, you know, to the members, right? And so that's what we saw a lot of these bills come to the floor. In regards to what I believe what his chances are as speaker, I think it's hard to tell, because Republicans, there was so much infighting in their primaries, right? And even now. And so they're so fractured that I don't think that any one group by itself would have the votes. But I think that, he's working towards, trying to build that coalition of folks. And so I think he'd be the front runner for sure. But it's still too early to say who's going to jump into the speaker race. And we've seen this stuff within minutes, right? Somehow this new candidate comes in and then they have the votes, right? And so it is hard to tell.
Former Governor Rick Perry just jumped onto Dave Phelan's advisory committee. That caught our attention. There's one point I'd like to make before we have to wrap it up that occurred to me. There's a lot of folks here that work for or are involved with nonprofits. So we operate under 501c3 status with the IRS, which has some restrictions on what we can and cannot do involved in political matters. But there's a myth, and this is just kind of something that has always annoyed me. There's a myth that 501c3s can't do advocacy work and can't speak out about political issues, and that is a complete and total myth. We have 3+ employees at Resource Center that focus full-time on advocacy issues, and I actually think it's part of a nonprofit's mission to ensure that what they stand for is consistent within the legislative process as well, and within the whole context of the society in which we operate. So if you have hesitation about that, I'd be glad to have conversations and connect you with our staff. There's some great resources. There's an organization called Boulder, BOLDER, Advocacy, and they do workshops and they have material about what you can and cannot do. They make it about as clear as it can possibly be. And we can do almost everything. We cannot endorse, and there's some rules, of course, there's situations for everything that you have to make a call on, but for the most part, we can do a lot, and we constantly and consistently speak out about topics. So if you're involved in those sort of things, please don't hesitate to speak out on behalf of your organization. If you have questions, let me know. And Shelly, how are we doing on time?
I think we're about there. I just wanted to make one point that Cece was talking about going to the legislature and testifying to the bill that actually became SB 14, which is what prohibited health care for transgender adolescents. And that's medically necessary, scientifically proven health care. And that day, there were about 2,000 people that dropped what we call dropped a card, and Jessica can correct me, against that bill passing. And there were about 96 that said, yes, we want it to pass. And yet our legislature still found it in its path to go ahead and pass that. And then, of course, the governor signed it into law. And I'm only saying that because it does take a lot of voices. And that was a lot of voices, but we have more voices where we can lift those voices up. And so for all of you, what I heard about not sitting on your hands, that's the message that I think I would leave everybody with. And so thank y'all.